Welcome into the Blue White Breakdown. I am Max Ralph, joined alongside Johnny McGonigal here. We are recording on a Wednesday morning. We're going to recap the college football playoff rankings as Johnny and I have done the last couple of weeks. But before we dive into it, got to know, Johnny, how we doing this morning?
Doing well, Max. Doing well. We've got less than 24 hours away from Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
One of I know our favorite holidays. Get to watch a
yeah,
lot of football, eat a lot of food, hang out, with family and friends before ultimately going up to. Well, you're already in State College. I know you have plans to travel elsewhere for Thanksgiving and then come back. So you
right.
will be joining me in returning to State College, going to State College for the Maryland game this weekend. You're
That's
going to
right.
Delaware, right?
Correct. Yeah. Going to spend some time with the girlfriend's family. I do love Thanksgiving. It's probably my second favorite holiday. And, it's because it's probably
Behind
the
Ar-
best.
behind Arbor Day, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Definitely not Christmas. Probably because of the meal, but this year might be a little bit painful considering I'm going to have to watch the Bears reinvent another catastrophic and heartbreaking way to lose at 12:30. It's just that's just beating me down week after week. But it should be good. I do love Thanksgiving. I'm going to be on pins and needles watching my fantasy teams this week because I have one that needs a win and some help to get into the playoffs. But it's going to be good.
Well,
Let's talk.
I was gonna say, you're gonna be in pain watching the Bears. I'm gonna be taking all the Lions player props and be,
Wow.
you know, sitting pretty watching that game. So looking forward to it.
You see, but I don't know if that's the answer because the Bears only allowed 2 catches to Justin Jefferson last week. So I don't know, but it's going to be bad. Anyway, I'm also in significant pain about the fact that the Dodgers signed Blake Snell last night because the rich just keep getting richer. And if any of you are a baseball fan and aren't Dodgers fans, this kind of sucks. But we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on. I'm fighting through the pain right now, Johnny. But Penn State last night in the college football playoff rankings, once again number 4. They've been number 4 ever since this thing started because of that loss to Ohio State, but they've handled business everywhere else. And the only real, I guess, controversy right now, considering Penn State's ranking, Johnny, is maybe some people want to argue that Notre Dame should be above Penn State. But other than that, I think, like we've said the past few weeks, Penn State goes and has a good performance against Maryland. They're really in the driver's seat for a home playoff game. And it all, I think, before we talk about kind of the rest of the rankings, if we just get to Penn State, for me, I think this makes sense where things are.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, they've stayed where they've been, like you mentioned, since the first iteration of the college football playoffs selection committee rankings came out earlier this month. Number one, Oregon, no surprise. Number two, Ohio State, especially after the Indiana win and their only loss being to Oregon, no surprise.
Hmm.
Texas at number three, they're going to have an opportunity to prove themselves right or wrong on that number three ranking this weekend at Texas A&M in a revival of a rivalry that I'm very much looking forward to watching. And then you
Yeah.
got Penn State at 4. And like you mentioned, there's been debate because there always has to be debate over the rankings, whether it's forced or not. I think in the case of Notre Dame, it's a little bit forced, but Notre Dame is sitting there at 5 behind Penn State. And Notre Dame is in a great spot too, to go get a first round home playoff game. They don't have a conference championship game they have to worry about. They never do. And they're playing at USC this weekend as just a little over a touchdown favorite. So, Penn State and Notre Dame take care of their business this weekend. They should be, hosting a first round home playoff game at Beaver Stadium and Irish Stadium specifically, or respectively. But there has been a debate, Max, because, like I said, there has to be one, right?
Yep.
What,
Always.
what are what are your thoughts? And I have my own, and I don't want to go on a total rant like I did the other week about the SEC and cut you out completely. But where do you stand on the whole Penn State Notre Dame thing at 4 and 5?
I mean, I think it's pretty easy. I have the same thoughts as you. One of these teams lost to a 6-5 MAC team. One of them did not, actually came back and had a great second half performance against a MAC team to make sure they didn't lose that game. Penn State's strength of schedule, according to ESPN, is number 32 in the country, and Notre Dame's is number 78. Yeah, of course the Irish are 10-1 because they played a terrible schedule. I mean, they're a good team, don't get me wrong. They deserve to be in the top 5 right now because they're 10-1 and they're crushing teams, but they don't deserve to be ahead of Penn State right now. I mean, I think Notre Dame would struggle just as much with that Minnesota team as Penn State did because it's a good Minnesota team. There's a good Illinois team that Penn State had to play. I don't think Notre Dame even gets close to beating Ohio State this year. Of course, now I sound like the SEC guys who say whatever, but I think even if you want to not put the hypothetical matchup argument into play here, if you literally just look at the numbers, like Notre Dame's strength of schedule is significantly worse. Their loss is significantly worse than Penn State's, and they don't have that quality win necessarily. I guess they got Texas A&M earlier this year, which that is a quality win. That's probably maybe better than any of Penn State's single wins, but Penn State has 2 or 3 good wins, I'd say, in the Illinois, USC, and Minnesota games. So I just, the strength of schedule number is there. I don't think there's any reason to look past that. Like, unless Penn State struggles with Maryland this weekend, I really just think that there's no reason that Penn State would be behind Notre Dame, like just from a numbers standpoint.
Like you mentioned, the strength of schedule number is there in favor of Penn State. Same with strength of record, which is a metric that ESPN created, and basically, how it measures how an average college football team would do against your schedule, and ranks teams accordingly. Penn State is number 4 in that category nationally. Notre Dame is number 10. And so I think there's a noticeable difference there. I think you could pick apart the wins a little bit as well, because the argument for Notre Dame is that, one, they've been dominant, and they have been, like, to their credit, since that Northern Illinois loss in September. They have been dominant, in their 9 straight wins, all have been by double digits. I believe 7 have been by 20 points or more. So they've been, beating teams, convincingly and comprehensively, with I think 303 margin of victory this year versus Penn State's 202, if I have those numbers correctly. So the other thing too is Notre Dame fans and supporters and those who just think they should be ranked ahead of Penn State will say that they have 4 wins over teams that were ranked at the time, which are Texas A&M, Louisville, Army, and Navy. And like, I'll give you A&M and I'll give you Louisville because I've watched Louisville this year and they've got an explosive offense and they're a solid team at 7-4. Army and Navy, like, you look at ESPN's FPI, how they rank the teams. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, all better teams this year than Army and Navy, and those 3 teams I think would be favored on a neutral field over both Army and Navy. So Notre Dame has probably the better of the 2 wins in Louisville. Like, Louisville and Illinois, I think are pretty similar. And then the Texas A&M win week 1 against a Texas A&M team that is very different now than it was then. At least to a degree. Like, I get it, I get the argument, but at the same time, I just come back to that Northern Illinois loss, and it's like, when you're splitting hairs, when you're deciding between 4 and 5. And I think it will matter too. Like, that difference between 4 and 5 could matter. I shouldn't say will, but could matter. One team lost to Northern Illinois at home, and one team didn't. And I think it just comes down to that, Max. I think it comes down to that.
Well, yeah, and it's just like, you mentioned that the Texas A&M team that Notre Dame beat is very different right now than it was back then. You could say that about any team. Like, that's always a thing in college football. Notre Dame's a much different team than the team that lost to Northern Illinois. Penn State is a much different team than the team that had a halftime deficit to Bowling Green. But the difference between those 2 statements is the fact that Penn State came back and won that game against Bowling Green. Notre Dame did not. They were held to 14 points or 13 against a mid-tier MAC team at home. I don't care if it's week 2 or 3. Like, why are we losing games to teams that are just not supposed to be on the same field as you? Like, that can't be just completely disregarded when you're talking about college football playoff rankings. And again, to this entire statement is not to say that Notre Dame doesn't deserve to host a home playoff game, because when you look at the entirety of the college football playoff rankings right now, there are too many 2 and 3 loss teams that Notre Dame is in good position, have no complaints with the fact that they might end up with the 6 or 7 seed. I think it's totally correct, totally fair. But to say that they could jump Penn State, in my opinion, I mean, obviously there's still one game left to play, and I think that there are some implications with both Notre Dame playing USC and Penn State playing Maryland, but I don't really think there's any reason to argue that Notre Dame should jump Penn State.
You mentioned that last game, the last weekend of the regular season that we have coming up in a few days here, Max, and the implications that it might have for Penn State's place in the college football playoff. And that brings us to a question from Brian G., one of our loyal subscribers to PennLive and our subtext. He asks, if Penn State narrowly escaped Maryland, shouldn't happen, and it shouldn't, and I don't think it will, and I don't think you think it will either. But if Penn State narrowly escapes Maryland, like they did at Minnesota, does that impact the chance of a first-round home game, or is that a lock with a win regardless? And where I'm iffy is, like, in my mind, I'm just like, okay, they're 11. If they win, regardless, they're 11-1. You know, they're probably hosting a playoff game, right? They're sitting number 4 in the country right now. My only thing is if they win close against Maryland, if it's tight, like, and truly tight, like a Minnesota in the fourth quarter tight, not a UCLA win by 16, but really Penn State dominates the game. And then Notre Dame goes out to Southern California and blows out USC.
Yeah.
I can understand Notre Dame jumping Penn State then, because, you know, Penn State needed overtime to beat USC. If Notre Dame goes out, now granted, different quarterback, different set of circumstances, we've talked about that, different, you know, in terms of USC, what they had to play for and what they had to play for now.
Yes.
Different team. But if Notre Dame goes out and wins by 28 and Notre Dame jumps Penn State in the rankings, that knocks Penn State from a projected 6 seed in the playoff, you know, down to a 7 seed. And then you're getting into iffy territory because, you know, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the teams that host the first round playoff game. 8, 9 is the cutoff.
Yep.
And then you bring into play what could happen conference championship weekend. Say Oregon were to lose, you know, to Ohio State. You know, if Ohio State lost, they might even stay ahead of Penn State. But, you know, you talk about what could happen in the SEC championship, what could happen in the ACC championship. There's a lot at play there. And so I think Penn State's place as a first-round home playoff game goes, I think it's pretty safe. But at the same time, you don't want to play with fire. Just go out and kill Maryland and be happy with what you got.
Yeah, conference championship weekend is really going to be interesting, especially considering the way the SEC has gone and the way the ACC has gone, where there's still, you know, it's still kind of up in the air who's playing there. We're fairly confident that it's going to be Ohio State and Oregon in the Big Ten. If Penn State sneaks in there with Ohio State losing to Michigan, that, of course, brings up a whole nother discussion where if Ohio State loses to Michigan, they will probably be in that 10 to 13 range, I would think, but or maybe a little higher, maybe 8 or 9. But anyway, if that happens, I don't think it will, but if it happens, big different conversation. But I think the SEC championship game is the one that I'm really interested in, because if you assume it ends up being Texas and Georgia as it's setting up to be right now, Texas is, if they lose like they did against Georgia earlier this year, like they're not going to be at risk of missing the playoff, in my opinion, because they're one of the fewer 2-loss SEC teams at that time. But I think they could drop all the way down and out of home playoff game contention because their resume is not that impressive. And so then you get into the question like, okay, yeah, even if Penn State struggles with Maryland a little bit, if conference championship weekend shakes out how it's supposed to, they might still be in that 7 or 8 range because, Miami could lose and drop down. Georgia could lose again, have 3 losses, and maybe go down to that 9 spot. I think that we have all, including myself, have maybe overlooked the fact that championship weekend is going to change a lot of what we've got in the college football playoff right now, because these teams are being projected into brackets, but the performances they have in those championship games are really going to tell a lot about the margins of home playoff game versus not, or the 10, 11, 12 versus 13, 14, 15, in my opinion. And especially, like I said, if Texas lays an egg against Georgia, that's going to change things greatly. There's a lot of ways that I think this could change, and I think I would predict. I'm not saying that the close win against Maryland would still mean Penn State is a lock for a home playoff game, but because of the way I think I see championship weekend going, I would predict Penn State still gets one.
I would too. But just to play devil's advocate on the Texas point a little bit, because you talked about them potentially laying an egg against Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if they go to Texas A&M this weekend, handle business convincingly,
Yeah.
and then that win there is better than anything Penn State has on its resume? If they were to handle Texas A&M convincingly, and then they go to the SEC title game and they lose in overtime to Georgia.
Yeah.
Texas is probably staying they're dropping out of the first round bye, which Georgia would take. But then I think they would probably stay at least they could stay ahead of Penn State, which again is then put in. So say all these things happen. And this is kind of like a doomsday scenario. This is what the question is getting at. So this is not us like wanting this to happen or predicting that it will happen, but just mapping it out. If Notre Dame ends up jumping Penn State next week, and then Texas, that happens for Texas, and they stay ahead of Penn State, Nittany Lions are down to the 8 seed at that point. And again, like the margins get really slim. And so it's possible. It's certainly not probable. It's certainly not probable. Like the likelihood of Penn State getting a first round home playoff game with a win this weekend, regardless of how it happens, is incredibly high. Incredibly high. But you don't want to leave any doubt. Don't leave any doubt.
Correct.
You're a 24.5-point favorite against Maryland. This is a team that the Big Ten, when Maryland came in, they wanted this to be a rivalry. It's not. It hasn't been. Penn State has smoked this team year in, year out. James Franklin, former Maryland head coach in waiting. It might be a little bit of a deal there.
Yeah.
Penn State has smoked this team year in, year out. Go and do it again.
Yep.
Get your backups in the fourth quarter. Celebrate senior day. Finish 11-1 on a high note at Beaver Stadium, and come back a few weeks later to host a first round playoff game.
Yeah, that's the blueprint, because even in that scenario where Texas loses close, you assume Ohio State and Oregon play each other close again in the championship game. You got Ohio State at 5, probably Notre Dame 6, Texas 7. But then I think, it's probably between Tennessee, Penn State, and the loser of the ACC championship for the 8th spot in the last home playoff game. I think you probably bank on Penn State getting that, but, there's a lot of ways it could go. I think my last point, Johnny, before we send this out is that I appreciate the way that the committee has handled this year. I think despite a lot of really attacking discourse on all different points so far, I think that the committee has continued to get things right. I think just from an objective perspective, I think it's fair that Indiana dropped to number 10, but I think it's smart that they're still in the field because they're 10-1 in a major conference. Really, probably the second best conference in the country. And so I think that's fair that they're still in. I also think it's great that they've said, SEC, you have too many 3-loss teams. You're going to be on the outside looking in until a couple of you prove yourselves. And I'm not saying that I don't think one of the 3-loss SEC teams could or should get in, but I think setting it up for this last weekend, they should have been on the outside looking in. And I think that the committee handled that well. So I don't know if you agree or have other thoughts, but I've been impressed. And I think that they have looked at this from a true the wins and losses matter point of view, and I think they've done a good job.
I would agree. I would agree. Despite some of the toxic discourse that we've talked about in recent weeks, I think they've done a good job. And looking at, Alabama, Ole Miss at 13, 14, and some people might look at the rankings and say, oh, like, they're going to backdoor a spot. Like, it's a possibility if some
Yeah.
chaos happens. Like, they might take Alabama over, the ACC champ, loser.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. But we'll have to wait and see. One thing to add, and talking about 3-loss SEC teams, just a quick little one. Don't forget about South Carolina.
That's where I was going.
Don't forget about South Carolina, because if they win at Clemson, Clemson's ranked number 12th right now. If South Carolina beats Clemson and they're 9-3, they could be that 3-loss SEC team. Just something to toss out there. One closing thought on the Notre Dame Penn State thing with respect to potentially losing a first-round playoff game with the conversation that we had and all the scenarios and everything. Thinking about it more, like I said, it's highly, highly probable that Penn State will get a first-round playoff game regardless with a win. I think the only real concern, I guess, on my end would be the seeding part of it, which again, like the ceiling the floor might be the 8th seed. The floor might still be hosting a playoff game.
Right.
But then you get into, you're playing the 9 seed, and then you have to go play the 1 seed in the quarterfinals, as opposed to where they are right now at the 6 seed. Don't think that's going to hold up. Probably land at the 7 seed. At that point, you're playing the 10 seed, and then you're playing, then you're playing probably the ACC champ in the quarterfinal. Like I think there's a big difference there in terms of the path to making an actual run in this thing. Max, there's so much still there's only 1 week of regular season games left and conference championship games, but there's still so much football left to be played in terms of, figuring all this crap out. But one thing I will mention is there are a lot of teams left in play.
Yep.
I had a story on PennLive published this morning after the rankings came out, taking a look at the scenarios and at the teams. And I counted 22 teams still in play for 12 slots.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot left to be decided, over this next weekend and as well as conference championship weekend. So interested to see how it all plays out, man.
Yeah. South Carolina Clemson is probably my top game to watch this weekend, because that could really shake things up. If South Carolina wins it, you got to think they're probably in for sure. Probably one of the better, if not the best resume among the 3-loss SEC teams. Maybe not for sure in, but at the top end of those teams. And the other thing that I do like that is probably a good sign for Penn State is that Boise State is inside the top 12 right now. And assuming that they handle business the rest of the way, win their conference, the Big 12 is see ya, because you have those four conference champions that are all inside the top 12, which is a good thing for Penn State, because you're not getting, a 15, 16, 17 team that is getting one of those automatic spots because of the conference championship.
I think they would get they just wouldn't get a bye. They would get, because it's the 5 highest ranked conference champs. So that get an automatic spot. So they wouldn't get a bye. But like the fact that, I agree with you on the Boise point. And then, it looks like if it's Arizona State or if it's Iowa State or BYU, they're probably going to be in the, 14, 15, 16 range and end up being the 12 seed and going and losing to Ohio State by 25 points, in the first round. But another thing to keep in mind, though, because we're talking other teams now, I guess, before we wrap this up. Mm-hmm. Another team to keep an eye on, and I've said it for weeks. I've been writing it for weeks, in the college football playoff stuff that I've written week in, week out. Do not sleep on Tulane. Do not sleep on the Green Wave, because right now they've got 2 losses. They play Memphis this weekend. If they beat Army in the AAC championship, win out 11-2, and Boise trips up against UNLV in the Mountain West Conference Championship game, assuming they play, which is still a little bit up in the air right now, Tulane could get in.
Yeah,
And Tulane, I actually think this might be a really hot take, but I think Tulane has a better chance of getting a win in the college football playoff right now with the way that they're playing than Boise does.
that's fair. I mean,
Boise's not playing well right now. They've got Ashton Genty; he's a god, but they're not playing well right now.
I just say they're fairly one dimensional. Like it's just plain and simple. He's great, but he's most of what they've got to offer right now. So I'm with you. Tulane is an interesting one. The Big 12 probably sneaks in and gets that 12 spot. I would say, Arizona State and Iowa State are both appearing to handle business the rest of the way, but that's been a fun conference and fun and frustrating in a lot of
Max,
ways.
there are like the Big 12 conference came out this week
Yeah.
and said there are still 256 different
Yep.
scenarios in
Yes.
which 256 different scenarios in which the Big 12 championship game could be played out.
Yes.
That's insane.
Doesn't West Virginia make it in one of them? So
Yes.
Penn State resume.
Like, and at that point, like, West Virginia is still technically alive. Baylor, Texas Tech, like,
Yeah,
if
it's
those
terrible.
teams somehow make it and then win the Big 12 championship,
Yep.
they're not going to be among the highest ranked conference champions that would get in the field. Then you could look at like Boise or UNLV and potentially, Tulane / maybe Army.
Yes.
That's what you could feasibly be looking at. There's an opportunity, there's a chance that the Big 12 gets left out completely because it's been, cannibalizing itself all year. Similar to the SEC, but it's the SEC.
Right. I think the Big 12 is a little bit worse, but it's entertaining for sure. You kind of figure I don't know. It's tough because for a long time BYU looked like they were going to just send it out and didn't happen. But I will say my last thing, Johnny, I feel like it would be good if the playoff reseeded after the first round, but I might be in the minority on that take. I don't know.
I think I agree with you.
Yeah.
I haven't mapped it out. I've said mapped out a lot this podcast.
You have.
I have.
You're a natural born cartographer.
Yeah, I'm just cartographer John. I'm gonna have to figure out a different phrase, a different word to use for next week's CFP podcast when we come on and we talk about where Penn State stands after beating Maryland by 1 billion. I think I agree with you on the reseeding, but maybe a conversation maybe an off-season conversation. That sounds like an off-season pod. Yeah. We'll see how it pans out this year and see, if it matters or if it doesn't.
I'm just generally a fan of reseeding because if you're going to put the teams in an order from 1 to 12, then they should, like the number 1 seed should always have the best advantage, and I get why like the NCAA basketball tournament doesn't do it because there's 68 teams and it's like a mess if you get to that point. But when there's only 12, like, I feel like you should reseed because if you earn the highest seed in the bracket, you should always be playing the lowest available seed. It's just that, in my opinion, that is like you've earned that right. But whatever, I'll get off my soapbox. Johnny, we've talked for long enough about this. We got the Penn State stuff out of the way in about 15 minutes, so probably 25% of the people that were watching this are still here. But it's always fun. The CFP conversation is wacky and wild, and even though there's only one game left and we feel pretty good about what we've got in front of us right now, conference championship weekend is going to change a lot of things. So stick with us. We're gonna keep bringing you analysis for the next 2 Wednesdays, I think, before the actual playoff starts. So stick with us, Johnny. Anything else you want to add?
Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Everyone enjoy family, friends, food, and football.
Yep.
Doesn't get much better.
Does not get much better. Travel safely if you're traveling. That's going to do it for us here on the Blue White Breakdown. We'll catch you around.